Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Colony Ship, a post-Earth role-playing game for PC. This is a science fiction role-playing game by Iron Tower Studio that was released into early access in 2021 and saw its full release in 2023, and while the game has been generally pretty positively received, it hasn't really gotten a huge amount of attention. Part of that is simply due to a general lack of advertising. Iron Tower Studio is a rather small development studio that has fairly limited resources, so they clearly put all that they could into the game and not as much into the marketing. And part of it is because they simply didn't aim the game at a general audience. You see, Iron Tower Studio isn't just a small developer, they're more or less known for making very niche games for a fairly small subset of role-playing game players. You see, their first game was The Age of Decadence, which they describe as a turn-based hardcore role-playing game set in a low-magic post-apocalyptic fantasy world. And that's a rather apt description of The Age of Decadence. I haven't gotten around to making a video on it. I do plan on doing that eventually. It's one of those games I started a long time ago but just never got around to finishing. So whenever I end up finishing The Age of Decadence, I will of course do a review on that as well. But I have played enough of it to know that it is definitely not the kind of game that I would recommend wholeheartedly to a general audience. It is just too punishingly difficult for a casual player to pick up. And the same is true for their spin-off title based on the Age of Decadence's engine and combat mechanics called Dungeon Rats. It's more of just a straight-up tactics game than an actual RPG like the Age of Decadence is, but it's very much aimed at the people who actually enjoyed the combat system in Age of Decadence, not just a general audience. And the developers themselves are quite upfront with this. They want to make sure that anybody going into their games knows what they're getting into, so they have things like playable demos, and they make sure that their descriptions on the store page are quite accurate. So the question then becomes, what's the situation with Colony Ship? Is it still something that's aimed squarely at hardcore RPG fans, or is it something that a more general audience can enjoy? And regardless of who it's aimed at, how is it as a role-playing game? Is it something that you should consider picking up? Well, let's just go ahead and delve right in and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with presentation. This game runs on Unreal Engine 4, although you wouldn't really know that unless you specifically looked into it or someone specifically told you, because it just doesn't really look like you would expect for an Unreal Engine game. That's not necessarily a problem, of course. It just means that when people hear the phrase Unreal Engine 4, they expect high-fidelity visuals, and usually it's going to apply to stuff that's more like first- and third-person shooters, action-adventure games, hack-and-slash games, stuff like that, not so much a more party-based RPG like Colony Ship is. But even when you look beyond that perception, Colony Ship doesn't do anything in the visual department that really takes advantage of the capabilities of Unreal Engine 4. It is not a particularly good-looking game. There aren't any of the fancy lighting, particle, or just post-processing effects in general that we really expect from Unreal Engine 4 games, and the modeling and texture quality is merely decent at absolute best. Character faces in particular look just odd and slightly misshapen, and they look a bit plasticky in terms of how the shader effects and the textures look on them. And all of the animations are quite simplistic, meaning that this game is just not going to impress you from a visual standpoint. However, the visual quality is offset quite a bit by the game's camera perspective. It is more of a top-down isometric perspective that's zoomed out a fair bit, so you're not necessarily going to be focusing on any kind of smaller details, and a lot of the stuff I've talked about you may not even necessarily notice all that much. You still certainly won't be impressed by the visual quality, but at the very least, it's sufficient enough that with the camera perspective they'd chosen and how zoomed out it is, it's not really a problem. But then you move over into sound design, and that's where things get a bit messier. There is absolutely no voice acting at all in this game, so everything in that department falls to sound effects and music, and the sound effects are not very good. They're not exactly awful either, but none of them really stand out, and the sounds of combat aren't anywhere near as visceral as I'd really hope for. Gun and explosion sounds are fairly basic across the board. They're not terrible, but they're not particularly good either, and the melee hits in particular just sound weak. They don't really have that nice, meaty, chunky sound that you'd really want from melee combat. I mean, when you have somebody running up and swing at somebody with a big makeshift axe, you want it to sound nice and chunky, not sound like like you're lightly slicing at a piece of cloth with a knife. And then there's the soundtrack, which is mostly electronic mixed with some additional instruments here and there that is meant to convey specific atmospheres based on the location that you're currently in, and it generally does a pretty good job of that, but for the most part is fairly forgettable once you get outside the confines of the game. That's not to say that the soundtrack is bad, because it's certainly not. It's a decent soundtrack, it's just that it doesn't really stick with you like some other soundtracks would. So when you bring all of that together, you end up with a game that's really not very impressive from a presentation standpoint, but that's not necessarily that big of a problem with a game like this, where it's being developed by a very small developer with very limited resources, and it's in a genre that doesn't generally concern itself all that much with presentation anyway. Now, the things that really matter in a game like this are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this game takes place in the year 2754 aboard the starship Starfarer, which was launched centuries prior by a Christian group that was bent on establishing a highly religious colony in a distant world far away in Proxima Centauri. But while those who initially launched the ship were fanatically devoted to this mission, the same can't be said for the generations that followed, and eventually the sacrifices demanded by the mission and the previous generations led to the younger generations just full-on rebelling against the fanatical devotees in an event that was simply referred to hence as the Mutiny, that resulted in the Old Order controlling the ship being thrown down, and in its place rose three major factions: the Brotherhood of Liberty, the Church of the Elect, and the Protectors of the Mission, of which the Church of the Elect remains relatively neutral, and they at least maintain a general policy of remaining neutral, whereas the Brotherhood of Liberty and the Protectors of the Mission are always in a state of conflict, simply because the Brotherhood of Liberty are idolizing the mutineers that overthrew the old regime, and they claim at least that they're all about the freedom of the shipborne, whereas the Protectors of the Mission are openly an authoritarian, militaristic regime that is bent on controlling everything on the ship with an iron fist. These factions have all carved out their own areas of control in what is left of the ship after the mutiny. It suffered extensive damage throughout all the fighting, resulting in the reactor being crippled in attempts to prevent it from melting down entirely, as well as numerous hull breaches. Various parts of the ship were flooded with lethal levels of radiation, and even to this day there are several parts of the ship that still have very dangerous levels of radiation in them, which are generally only braved by the population of mutants aboard the ship. They started to spring up, of course, when the reactor started having serious problems, and as one might unfortunately expect, they weren't exactly welcome among the general population, so they were shunned by society until eventually they were like, look, we will maintain the reactors and such, the dangerous parts of the ship that none of the rest of you can really maintain, but in return you leave us out of your various political squabbles and all that crap. We just do our thing here and keep the ship running, and the rest of you just stay out of our way. And in this world where the Brotherhood of Liberty is hell-bent on, air quotes, liberating everybody on the ship, whether they want to be liberated or not, the Protectors of the Mission are hell-bent on restoring the original order of the ship so that they can complete the original mission that the Founding Fathers intended when they launched the ship in the first place. And the Church of the Elect is saying that both of those factions are complete fools, and then they need to actually focus on their devotion to God, because everything aboard the ship is a test of faith, and when eventually they arrive at Proxima Centauri, Judgment Day will occur, and the chosen few will be led to the Promised Land and be able to establish the new colony, whereas all of the sinners will be sent back to hell, aka Earth. All while the ship is actively decaying around them, where machinery that is vital to supporting life is being held together effectively with toothpicks and chewing gum, just whatever scrap people can throw together to keep it repaired. Resources are actively dwindling, and society has formed into cadres of haves and have-nots. There has become a massive divide between the two settlements, I guess you can call them, within the ship. You have the habitat, which is the original residential area of the ship, which has been repurposed into effectively fortresses on top of being residential areas, and that's where all of the people who can afford it live, whereas the player starts off their journey in the pit. effectively a cargo hold full of shipping containers that have been repurposed into whatever kinds of accommodations that they can muster. Some call it the Free City, which might sound appealing, except that, again, it's not really a city so much as it is just a bunch of cargo containers that they've thrown together to make something vaguely resembling housing. And more importantly, while it is free from the main faction's control, it also has basically no government at all, so the only rules the area has are the rule of strength and do whatever you have to survive. It is into this environment you are dropped after you finish character creation, and from there you're given one main lead, that you have been previously working with a guy named Tanner, who is some sort of local hustler who gives you odd jobs every now and then. And when you go to see if he has another job for you, he provides you with a key card that will allow you into Armory Level 2, which is something that scavengers have been trying to get into for a long time, unsuccessfully of course. And with so much of the ship already having been looted and scrapped for whatever was useful, the armory being effectively a pristine area of the ship that hasn't been accessed since the mutiny is effectively a holy grail. It is the promise of riches untold, at least as far as the player character has ever seen and heard of. And I don't want to spoil too much of the story here, but suffice to say, once you get into the armory and you find what's hidden within, it's something that can tip the balance in favor of any of the three major factions, and it can change not only the balance of power on the ship, but just the fate of the ship in general. From there, the story becomes quite predictable, because once you've gotten to the habitat in order to figure out what this thing you found is in the first place, you ultimately have to figure out which one of the factions you want to deliver this thing to, and in order to do that, you need to get into their good graces first. So you have to complete a mission or two for them before they will let you in to speak with a high-ranking representative, and then once you've talked to that person about it, you set things in motion to effectively turn their faction into the dominant faction aboard the ship, and determine the ship's fate. Along the way, of course, you learn more about the ship, its history, the people currently living aboard it, what the current situation is. You also learn that the main story is one of the weaker elements of the game, because when you first start the game out, it's barely even there at all. Until you actually go to the armory and find the thing hidden within it, you can actually completely ignore the main story and just go off and do a bunch of side quests, which, frankly, I would recommend if you're playing on the game's standard difficulty, which is Underdog, but I'll explain more about that when I get to the gameplay. And even when you do go into the armory and find this thing, there's really no rush from there, because you won't be able to actually get to the habitat to find out what this thing is until you resolve the main, mostly unrelated conflict in Chapter 1, which is who is ultimately going to be in control of the pit. So you're going to spend nearly the entirety of Chapter 1 doing things that are completely unrelated to the actual main story of the game, and then once you finally get back on track and you make your way to the habitat, you're right back to just doing odd jobs and doing effectively side content until eventually you can get into the graces of one of their particular factions so that you can talk to one of their leaders and actually then go back into the main storyline. And even when you do that, when you go back into the main storyline and you hand over this thing to one of the factions, they look at it and say, oh, well, it needs a bunch of different things to become useful to us, so now you need to go off into these other areas and effectively do more side content in order to find the things we need to make this thing useful to us. This is all to say that for the vast majority of the game, the main storyline is actually just in the background. You're mainly focusing on a bunch of barely related, if even related at all, either side content outright or stuff that feels like side content in order to get you back on track in the main storyline, and then you're only given the main storyline for very brief interludes until you get to the very end of the game and it locks you into the last few bits of main storyline before you get to whichever ending your choices have ultimately led you to. Even though the storyline outright tells you that this thing you're doing is incredibly important, there's never any real feeling of urgency, And as such, not only is it quite easy to lose interest in the plot overall, but it's also quite easy to just forget the game has a main plot in the first place until suddenly it reminds you of it in the very, very brief moments where it does actually come up with main plot information. And even when it does give you that information, more often than not, it's through exposition dumps, which are just about the most boring way you could possibly tell a story. Now, I get that the developers had a very limited budget, so there was only so much they could show rather than tell, but it does ultimately result in the main storyline being considerably less interesting than it really could be. The setting, on the other hand, is very interesting. You want to learn more about it. You want to learn more about the factions. You want to learn more about the mutiny and what kinds of effects it had on the ship. You want to learn more about how these people are able to sustain life aboard this vessel. And the fact that not only do your choices throughout the game have consequences that you can usually observe a bit later on in the game, but also the choices you make have a direct impact on the balance of power on the ship and the ultimate fate of everybody living aboard this vessel, means that it's a lot easier to get invested in the actual setting and the characters within that setting than it is to get into the main story itself. So weirdly enough, despite the weakness of the main story itself, it ends up not being as big of a problem as I really thought it would, because the rest of the writing more or less makes up for it. It's a setting that's interesting, you want to explore more of it, you get more wrapped up in that than how weak the main storyline is. Now that said, of the two, the setting is far easier to get into than the characters are. The characters themselves are decently written, don't get me wrong, but there's just not a whole lot going on with them. They will comment on certain choices that you make, and when you're wandering around different areas of the ship, your companions will comment on that particular area of the ship. They will also comment on your decisions, of course, and they might even offer some additional insights or alternate objectives as you're going through various quests and such. But once you've gone through the main introductory dialogue for any of these characters, but especially the companions, there's just not really anything after that. You exhaust the introductory dialogue, and then from then on out, it's purely just reacting to things that are specifically related to quests attached to them, and that's pretty much it. It's not necessarily a huge problem, because that's more or less how characters are handled in most role-playing games, but unlike those other role-playing games, everything feels more expedient in Colony Ship, as if they more or less were running into budgetary restraints, and so they had to just cut down the dialogue to only what they have in the game, only things that are actually relevant to stuff that you're doing, only having characters comment on things specifically related to them or specifically related to the main storyline, and really not much else. Again, it's not necessarily a huge issue, but it is something you'll notice throughout a playthrough, and it limits your ability to really get attached to any of the characters. Thus, what mostly ends up driving this game in terms of writing is actually just the setting and the way they've implemented choices and consequences. You see, unlike so many games out there that call themselves role-playing games but have no actual role-playing in them, no actual choice and consequence, Colony Ship very much is a role-playing game. You make a decision, it has consequences, and you have to live with those consequences, or just load a previous save and then try something else and see where that leads you. And those choices are going to be influenced by how you've set up your character. Is your main character more of a diplomatic sort? Are they more of a direct combat character? Are they more the sneak around and stab people in the back while stealing stuff kind of character? How you've set up your main character is ultimately going to dictate which options you have when figuring out how you want to deal with a particular situation. And the developers have generally done a very good job of making sure that every situation has multiple solutions. If you want to play as your typical murder hobo protagonist, then you can do that. You can just blast your way through pretty much any situation. If you want to avoid direct conflict and use stealth to your advantage, you can do that too. And if you want to just talk your way out of every situation, you can absolutely do that as well. You can actually get through this entire game completely non-violently if you really want to. It all depends on how you set up your main protagonist and who else you have in your party. You have a maximum of 4 party slots, although the amount of followers you can actually have is determined by your charisma stat. and the other party members can make up for the main character's deficiencies. So let's say that you spec your main protagonist out to be entirely a smooth talker with basically no combat skills whatsoever. Well, if you're going that route, then that means you're going to have a high charisma stat, meaning you can have 3 additional party members, and those party members can make up for any deficiencies the main character has. You can spec out one of them to be a stealth character, so whenever you come up to a situation that requires stealth, and your persuading skills aren't necessarily up to the task, or they might depend on being able to sneak in and grab something, then you can have your stealth character go in, sneak in there, grab whatever they need to grab, and then get out, and then the main character can take back over and smooth things out from there. Or if you run into a situation where your persuasion skills aren't necessarily high enough to be able to talk your way out of a situation and stealth isn't necessarily going to work, then having additional characters in your party that are really good at combat and can take the hits for you and dish out the damage for you is obviously going to be quite important as well. If somebody has a high lockpicking skill, they can get into lock containers and then you can get some of the better loot in the game. And the same kind of thing goes for the computers and electronics skill. If you have high electronics, you can repair various things, you can scrap things for parts, and so on and so forth. And if you have high computer skill, then you can get into terminals and get more information. You might be able to disarm various traps or enemy robots and such like that. And you might even be able to open doors that you don't necessarily have a high enough lockpicking or electronics skill to be able to get through. This is all great stuff. It is exactly the kind of stuff you want to see in a proper role-playing game. Hell, even your party's reputation can sometimes be used to influence the outcome of a situation. You might be able to use your combat reputation, for example, to diffuse a sticky situation by saying, look, you guys know that we're badasses, so you know how this is gonna go if you try to throw down with us, and that might actually get people to back down from a potential combat scenario. That particular feature is very unevenly applied, however. I only ran into 1 or 2 instances in the entire game that actually gave you an option to use your combat reputation to try to diffuse a situation, and even though the game does keep track of reputations for exploration, stealth, and diplomacy, I don't remember seeing prompts for any of those in my entire time throughout the game, and I was going out of my way to complete as many side quests as I possibly could. The game does also keep track of your reputation with the various factions, and I don't remember that ever coming up in any kind of dialogue options either. And another thing it keeps track of that I also don't remember ever coming up in any dialogue options is your character's individual beliefs. You set those with a few questions that you answer during character creation, and then throughout the rest of the game that will change depending on the various decisions you make, but it just seems to be there for flavor and doesn't seem to have any actual mechanical purpose. But the main factor determining what choices you're going to be able to make is the skills that your party, and more specifically your main character, is spec'd out with. So let's go ahead and talk about both character creation and how this whole system actually works. So when you go into character creation, you are given a bunch of points to distribute among your stats, which consist of strength, constitution, dexterity, perception, intelligence, and charisma. And as you might expect, these various stats have a bunch of derived stats, and some of those are actually a combination of multiple stats. So, for example, charisma will determine what your initial disposition is with any particular NPC, as well as how many maximum followers you can have, whereas intelligence determines how many tagged skills you have, what your experience bonus is, and what your neural resistance is. Meanwhile, strength and constitution will influence things like how many hit points you have, how many maximum implants you can have, what kind of extra damage you can do in melee combat, as well as how much recoil control you have when you're firing things in full automatic, as well as your armor handling, which the higher that value is, the heavier armor you can wear. And then dexterity and perception will influence things like how many action points you have to take actions during combat, as well as what your evasion bonus is, what your initiative bonus is, so you can act sooner in combat, accuracy, your reaction percentage, as well as, of course, your abilities with stealth. Most of these derived stats are things that make total sense, and when you look at them and you look at the values compared to what your stats are, it's a pretty straightforward calculation that makes sense. Then there's things like the stealth stats for noise, sneaking, and takedown. Now, sneaking is pretty straightforward. It's a value that's just added to the enemy's ability to detect you when you're trying to sneak around. But then there's noise and takedown. Takedown is a value that, from the way it's described in the game, seems more or less like your base accuracy, but for doing stealth takedowns. And by the way, if you're planning on being more of a pacifistic character, then you don't want to be using stealth takedowns because they require you to have a dagger. They are always lethal takedowns. But anyway, that's what the takedown stat does. And then there's the noise stat, which, from how the game describes it, is the amount of noise you make whenever you're just moving around while in stealth. It also says the effect is cumulative, and it's a bit confusing. We'll come back to that one, though. At any rate, those are your stats and the kinds of derived stats that they influence, and then from there you have a bunch of skills that you can pick. Obviously, they're your basic combat style skills, things like what kind of melee weapons you prefer to use, bladed or blunt, what kinds of ranged combat you want to engage in, whether it's pistol, shotgun, rifle, or submachine gun, as well as a few other skills related to combat, critical strike, evasion, and armor. Armor, which, of course, allows you to equip more heavy armor. Evasion, which allows you to just avoid damage entirely. And critical strike, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It influences your critical hits. Then there are the skills that will actually influence your ability to do things in the world. There are the three science skills: biotech, computers, and electronics, with biotech allowing you to extract implants from corpses, as well as occasionally do some medical-related things. Computers, of course, being what I've already described, and electronics being what I've already described. And then there are your three speech skills, which are persuasion, streetwise, and impersonate, all of which are pretty straightforward. They're just different approaches to trying to talk your way through situations. And then there are your three stealth skills, which are lockpick, again, very straightforward, just allows you to get into locked containers, steal, and sneak. Steal basically being your pickpocketing skill, and sneak being your overall ability to sneak around during the stealth sections. Now, the skills are all quite straightforward in how they actually work in-game. It's just a simple check. Do you have the skill of this particular level? If so, then you can complete this task. If not, then you cannot complete that task. And this is true both during dialogue sequences and just with various things you can do in the world. For example, if you come across a corpse and it has an implant in it, then you need to have a certain level of the biotech skill in order to successfully extract that implant. And if your biotech skill isn't at a high enough level, then it will just say that you can't extract that implant without damaging it at your current skill level, and then you can come back later when you do have the appropriate skill level and extract it successfully. Same kind of thing is true for computers, electronics, lockpicking, etc. The only times you're really going to be locked out of attempting a skill check again are during dialogue sequences, because when you're in the dialogue sequence itself, it'll give you the option, and if your skill level's not high enough, then you're not going to get that option again later. There are a few exceptions with things like lockpicking, computers, electronics, etc., and those are related to when you go to specific locations as part of either a specific quest or as part of the main story, and you only get access to that area once. But other than those instances, whenever you go into an area and you find a particular thing that you currently can't do because your skill is too low, then you can come back later when your skill is at the appropriate level and reattempt that. Now, regardless of which skills you're using, whenever you make a skill check, you earn experience points, or learning points as the game specifically refers to them, in that specific skill, and so your skill will actually level up with use. This is important because once you get out of character creation, there is no additional way of upgrading your skills. You can't just go into the stat screen during a level up and add a couple of extra points into a particular skill. During character creation, however, you have the ability to tag certain skills as well as distribute 4 free points. So the way tagging works is that based on your intelligence value, you have a maximum number of tagged skills, and when you tag a particular skill, it increases that skill's level by 2. Meanwhile, the 4 free points you have to distribute among the various skills will only increase whatever skill you put them in by 1 each. So when it comes to speccing out your character as well as your companions, the tagged skills are going to be the main determining factor in what they're actually really good at. And this does indeed apply to your companions as well. Whenever you recruit your companions, you can select which skills you want to tag for them. There's also a list of character feats, some of which can only be selected during character creation, and some of which require you to have stat values at a certain level in order to be able to apply them. And one of these feats, called Educated, allows you to select an additional tagged skill, but that is the only way you are able to improve your skills through the leveling process. Once you've got your tagged skills selected and your 4 points distributed, then you can jump into the rest of the game, and from there on out, your choices are going to be determined by what skills you have access to and what your party composition is. And from there, things get rather messy. The first thing you need to contend with is the game just being a bit obtuse in certain regards. For example, I said that you can have your party members compensate for skill deficiencies you have, but you need to manually set them to do that. And in order to do that, you need to go into specifically the party management screen and designate which character in your party you want to complete various skill checks. So you can set one character to do lockpicks, you can set one character to do electronics, one to do computers, so on and so forth. And whenever you come across something in the world that doesn't give you a dialogue option to say, hey, get this person in your party to go do this thing instead of you trying it yourself, you can just click on that thing and the character will automatically use the skill check. But again, it's not set by default. By default, you just attempt everything yourself whether you have the requisite skill or not, so you have to go into the party management screen and specifically set which characters you want to use which checks. You also need to go into this screen in order to heal. You don't automatically heal after combat, and you can't just use medkits to heal your party. You have to specifically go into the party management screen and select the amount of healing you want to apply to each individual character, or just check the fully heal after combat option and then never worry about it ever again. It's just weird the way they've set this up. But once you get past some of those obtuse interface and gameplay mechanic choices, the rest of the experience is still going to be pretty uneven. There are tons of opportunities to use persuasion, streetwise, lockpick, biotech, computers, and electronics, and in fact many of these have redundancies built in, so if your lockpick skill isn't high enough to open a door, for example, you can try using computers or electronics to get around it too. But then there's the really odd one out, which is the impersonate skill. There are very few instances where you're actually able to use this skill at all, and some of them require you to have also used stealth to get, say, a badge, and then be able to use that to help you impersonate someone. And because of the way the skill checks work, with them being a simple pass-fail system where if you have the skill at a particular number, then you will pass, and if you don't have it at that number, then you will fail, you can actually lock yourself out of completing a particular skill check simply because you haven't been able to level up whatever skill is required enough to be able to complete that check. To give you an example without really spoiling the details of it, because it's from something pretty late in the game, there was one particular situation that I got myself into where I needed electronics at, I believe, skill level 7 in order to be able to complete a particular check and avoid combat, but my character's electronics level was one level short on that, and I didn't have anybody else in the party using the electronics skill because it was all on my main character. So I was absolutely scouring the area around where I was currently in order to try to find any skill check I possibly could complete to try to level that skill up to the appropriate level, and I just couldn't in that particular area, so I thought to myself, well, I'll try going somewhere else and then come back, and then it told me, oh, by the way, in this particular case, if you try to leave this area before completing it, then you'll lose access to the area that was beyond this encounter. And I was thinking to myself, oh crap, I've basically soft-locked myself. So I had to load a previous save, go scour the entire game for electronic skill checks until I was barely able to get my skill level high enough to be able to complete the check, and then I was able to complete the check and avoid the combat situation and continue exploring. It was a thoroughly frustrating situation because my only other options there were combat, which I would have lost, or to simply forfeit the area I was exploring and lose access to everything beyond that point. And it was entirely due to the way the skill check and skill leveling system works. The leveling part of it is more or less fine. It makes sense to level up skills as you use them. The only real problem with it is that skill checks aren't evenly applied across all of the skills, so with some of them you're just going to have more opportunities to level up a particular skill than others, and whenever redundancies are involved, you need to be going out of your way to make sure that the skill that is currently leveled below the other option is the one you actually use so that you can get experience in it and prevent yourself from being kind of soft-locked like I was. And that simple pass-fail check system definitely could have been improved if it was more of a percentage chance, for example, that is improved based on your skill and the stat that governs that skill, rather than just the, do you have skill at this number? If not, fail. If so, succeed. And it is fairly odd, a game that is clearly aimed at the so-called hardcore RPG audience exclusively uses these simplistic pass-fail checks rather than using dice roll checks. So while the game does give you options based on what your stats and skills are, it does so very unevenly and in a system that mechanically is not only inelegant, but is often kind of frustrating. And I wouldn't really have as much of an issue with this if it weren't for the way the combat and stealth mechanics work. Now, the way combat works is that it is turn-based and there is an initiative order. Every single character has an initiative value, and whenever you go into a combat situation, you can actually see the entire turn order listed in the top left of the screen, and it will tell you what the initiative value of your characters and the enemy characters are, and whatever their initiative value determines what order everybody acts in. When it comes to a particular character's turn, then they'll have a number of action points that can be used to complete anything that they're doing, whether it be moving, attacking enemies, using special attacks, using an item, throwing a grenade, whatever it may well be. When combat starts, you can set your character's starting locations and activate any kind of defensive gadgets they've got, which are going to be distortion fields or energy shields. And then from there, combat turns into a fairly complicated affair because it's all about the math from then on out. So as is described on the game's store page, the accuracy of your shot is 50, your base accuracy value, plus your bonuses from your stat, plus your skill, plus any feats that you've got, plus any implants that you got, plus your helmet and your goggles, plus whatever weapon you're using. This is then further modified by any penalties that are inflicted upon the character that you're currently controlling, as well as your weapon's effective range and whichever attack you happen to be using. And then evasion is determined by your bonuses from your stat, your skill, your feat, the implant, the armor handling, and then if you have an armor penalty, which means that you have gone over your armor handling value and you now have a penalty being applied, then that is subtracted from your evasion value. Evasion, of course, being what you use to avoid damage entirely. You also get cover bonuses, so there's full and half cover, and then of course there's bonuses from things like your gadgets, as well as any kind of smoke or spore cloud that is currently obscuring vision. Trying to manage all of this and turn things in your favor is quite tricky, and if you're playing on the underdog difficulty, which is the standard difficulty, then you will find combat is infuriatingly difficult as a result of all of it. You see, when you select an underdog difficulty, it tells you that your character and the enemies will play by the same rules, which will greatly increase your mortality. This is true, and you would think that it would make the game hard but fair. While it certainly makes the game difficult, it doesn't make it fair, because the enemies are almost always far better equipped than you in almost every instance, and more likely than not, they're going to have far better stats than you, so they're going to be constantly hitting you for high amounts of damage, and you're going to be able to do pretty much jack shit to them. Hell, even if you have completely spec'd your entire party out to be a combat-focused party, the combat is still punishingly difficult. And that is mostly due to how the combat encounters themselves are designed. They're just straight up unfair to the player in nearly all instances. You're more likely than not going to start combat in very close quarters, with little to no cover between you and the enemies, many of whom are probably going to be equipped with melee weapons, and if somebody gets into melee combat with someone else, then they will have to get out of cover and lose their cover bonus, and can no longer react to any other characters. They can only react to the person they're in melee with, and trying to shoot at characters who are involved in melee will more likely than not provoke a reaction, if it's even possible at all. With some weapons, it's not actually possible to do that, and even if it is possible, possible, they have such low accuracy that at absolute best they're likely to just do some grazing hits rather than some actual significant hits. And as for reactions, well, they're pretty poorly explained in the game. I know the reaction stat has something to do with it, but it seems like the reactions are triggered at absolute random. Sometimes they're triggered by an enemy missing an attack, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're triggered by moving, sometimes they're not. It's just hard to determine exactly what is going to cause a reaction shot, and you can't set characters in any kind of Overwatch mode so that you can specifically provoke reaction shots when, say, a character moves into a particular zone of control. And between how obtuse these mechanics can get and how poorly most of the combat encounters are designed, combat on the underdog difficulty is just generally pretty infuriating, and you will want to be avoiding it as much as possible unless you have specifically spec'd your entire party out to be a combat-focused party, and even then it is still going to be immensely frustrating. But then there's the other end of the spectrum. You might be thinking to yourself, oh, well, if the game is so punishingly difficult on underdog difficulty, why not play it on hero difficulty, which is the sort of easy mode? Well, that's where things get wacky, because hero difficulty increases your party's skill gain by 100%, it increases the party's accuracy by 30%, it reduces the enemy's accuracy by 40%, and if a party member is under 50% hit points, then their accuracy against that character is reduced by 80%, and their critical chance is limited to 5% maximum. You also get an increase in the death timer, which is the amount of turns it takes before a character just bleeds out entirely, and that ends up going from 3 turns to 7 turns, and you start with better gear. You see, the bonuses you get from the hero difficulty settings and the penalties applied to enemies make the combat so laughably easy that it's just downright boring. Now, there is a custom difficulty option, and you could probably go in there and tweak the settings such that you might be able to get a reasonable challenge in the combat without it just being so punishingly difficult that it's just infuriating, or so easy that it's just downright boring. But no amount of adjusting difficulty settings is ever going to fix how poorly the combat encounters are designed. Most of them just put your party at a massive disadvantage, and in the rare instances where the party isn't placed at a massive disadvantage, the encounters themselves just still aren't very interesting. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the combat system in this game, while theoretically sound, is just awful in implementation. It is something that, again, you want to be avoiding as much as you possibly can, simply because not only is it just not fun, but depending on your difficulty setting, it can be incredibly frustrating or mind-numbingly boring, and there's really not much in between there. And you might be thinking to yourself that you can use stealth to try to avoid combat, and you theoretically can, except that the stealth system is based on the combat system. It's also turn-based, and the action point system applies. And every single action you take, whether it's simple movement or interacting with something, generates noise. And the game does an incredibly poor job of telling you exactly how much noise you're making. You do have the noise stat, and whenever you go to interact with something, it will tell you how much noise that action will take, but there's no count anywhere on the interface that tells you exactly how much noise you're making. The only way you know how much noise you're making is observing the detection meters above enemies' heads, and that doesn't give you any kind of precise information either. It just gives you a vague idea that doesn't really give you the information you need to be able to properly sneak. More importantly, the way the sneaking part of this is even set up is that whenever you're moving around the various tiles, there are red, green, and yellow indicators on them that will dictate how much detectability is on that particular tile. So if you go into a green tile, then you won't be detected. If you go into a yellow tile, it's safe to move through those, but if you end the turn on a yellow tile, then you will be detected on the next turn, and if it's a red tile, then you will just be discovered instantly and the stealth section will end. The range of red, green, and yellow tiles is determined both by your sneaking skill as well as any kind of additional bonuses you might have from things like feats, as well as whether or not you are currently using a cloaking device. Now, cloaking devices only last for a very small number of turns, and they can only be used once per stealth encounter. And while you can at least move around to try to avoid characters' lines of sight, the only way to avoid detection by the cameras in most instances is going to be using the cloaking device, so you need to be very careful with how you use that. It means that the stealth system is going to be a hell of a lot of trial and error, and frankly, it becomes downright infuriating trying to deal with it. So, ironically, while the game gives you quite a few options to deal with pretty much any situation, more likely than not, you're going to be trying to pick the ones that will allow you to avoid using the stealth system and the combat system as much as possible, thereby severely limiting your actual options. And that is just immensely frustrating because, like I said, it has the element that you really want to see in role-playing games. That choice and consequence and having a lot of options for dealing with pretty much any situation. But then because the stealth and combat mechanics are fairly obtuse, and the combat encounters in particular, but even the stealth encounters to a lesser degree, are so poorly designed, the player's going to probably try not to interact with at least the combat and stealth mechanics as much as they can in order to avoid all of the frustrations of it. So then the game becomes almost entirely about using the computers, electronics, persuasion, and streetwise skills, because again, the impersonation is just so rarely used in the game. And while that's fine for people who enjoy playing through games and using primarily persuasion and technical skills to get through everything, that's just going to alienate a decent chunk of the audience, and it's definitely going to limit replayability as well, because if people feel like they're effectively being pushed to play the game a very specific way, the only real difference is going to be the specific choices that you make. So, what faction you side with, who you side with in various struggles for power, that sort of thing. At which point you might as well just maintain a bunch of save files and just go back and change the decision you make on whichever character you happen to be playing, and just see how things play out differently. This is all to say that at absolute best, Colony Ship is a very mixed bag of a game, and it's also very short. I completed the entire thing in 13.5 hours. And again, I was going out of my way to try to complete as many side quests as I could that weren't just specifically related to combat. And while that might sound long to especially somebody who plays nothing but first-person shooters, for example, it's really short for a role-playing game. Now, that's not necessarily a huge problem, because by the time I finished the game, that was really the extent of what I was able to put up with in terms of the combat system and the stealth system playing on the underdog difficulty. I then started a new character on the hero difficulty and proceeded to complete the entirety of Chapter 1, out of 4 total chapters, by the way, in the span of about 2.5 hours. Now granted, I knew exactly what I was doing at that point, but even making different choices, it still only took me that long to get through the entirety of Chapter 1, and I really don't see it taking any longer than my original playthrough to get through the rest of the game, even making different choices and even going through all of the combat encounters and stealth encounters and such. Now, the simple fact of the matter is that Colony Ship is a very rough and very short RPG experience, and it's also one with very limited appeal. Very few people are going to be willing to put up with the game's faults in order to get to the actually good stuff that's there. Like I said, it does things that you really want an RPG to do. It does have a pretty good sense of choice and consequence. It gives you a lot of options to complete various tasks. There are multiple endings based on the choices you've made, and the choices you've made do come back later on in the game, and you do get to see the consequences of your actions. And on top of that, it all takes place in a setting that is legitimately really interesting and that you want to see more of and want to learn more about. But in order to get to the good stuff, you have to get past the downright crap combat and stealth systems, as well as very unevenly applied additional mechanics that will more or less just steer you into effectively playing the same character over and over again. And because of all of that, unfortunately, I really can't give Colony Ship anything higher than a 2.5 out of 5 on my scale. It's a very rough experience that is really only going to appeal to a fairly niche audience. And while I highly doubt they'd be able to go back and make significant improvements to the gameplay mechanics, at the very least they might be able to go back and tweak some of the combat and stealth encounters to make them, at the very least, less obnoxious. Or maybe they can go back and add in a few extra skill checks here and there to try to even out how unbalanced that can be. And they could certainly go back and add in more detailed information about what everything actually does mechanically, so the mechanics themselves are less obtuse and you really understand what is going on. And they could also go in and tweak the interface to make it less cumbersome and just reduce some of those oddities that are a bit annoying but aren't really a serious problem in and of themselves. But pretty much everything else is set in stone at this point, and it's just going to be a matter of whether you're able to put up with the game's issues long enough to get to the good stuff. And weirdly enough, the game's rather short length might actually help in that regard, because you just have less time that you need to put up with certain issues in order to get to the good stuff. And if after everything I've described thus far, you're still not really sure whether this is something that you might be interested in playing, I would say just try the demo. It has a demo available, you can give it a try, see how the mechanics are, see if that's something you might be interested in, get a taste for the setting, and then maybe consider picking up the full version depending on how your experience with the demo goes. I do have to say, however, that the asking price right now, which is $40 US, or whatever the regional equivalent in your region is, does feel a bit steep considering what the experience of Colony Ship is like and how short of a game it is. So even if you do end up enjoying your time with the demo, I would still say you might want to wait for the game to go on sale before picking up the full version. And hopefully the developers learn from their mistakes in whatever their next project is and make sure to balance things out a bit more to make sure things don't end up quite as uneven and rough as they did in Colony Ship. Because Iron Tower Studio definitely has a very good understanding of what an RPG should be, it's just that the execution of those ideas in Colony Ship was really rough, and with some refinement they can make something truly phenomenal. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand, but the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really helps out. You'd be amazed how even $1 a month can help out. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.